Hi, welcome to the MIT Mobility Forum. This is session 177. A year ago, we had a session on EV in a fractured world, US-China trade war, and a global auto industry. At that time, John Momanzadi, Jack Evans, and myself discussed the stiff US tariff on the Chinese EV and tried to look at what's the potential impact upon automobile producers and consumers. But 12 months on, what has happened? Today, we re-examine this question. For example, given the tariff protection, did the US OEM choose to treat it as a precious learning time window and invest in EV innovation, or just sit on the comforting ICE margin of selling more expensive SUVs? Right. There are many questions we should ask, and how China respond to that. How does this Canada, US, and Mexico relationship change? John designed this session today. I will invite John to moderate the session, and thank for the Susan, John Paul, and Jack, the brilliant panel to join us today. Off to you, John.
Super. Okay. Thanks so much, Chinua. Yeah, I mean, we're about 13 months in since President Trump's Liberation Day, which imposed a system of much higher tariffs on a number of countries around the world. And the question we're asking today is, what has been the impact on the automotive industry, and why does all of this matter? We have three really, really amazing people here to help us kind of think this through. I want to introduce a panelist. First off, Susan Helper is the Frank Tracy Carlton Professor of Economics at the Weatherhead School of Management at Case Western University. Dr. Helper has served as a senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors in the Obama administration, chief economist at the U.S. Department of Commerce, and senior advisor for industrial strategy and management at the White House Office of Management and Budget. Sue's research focuses on the U.S. manufacturing system and ways in which it can be strengthened and revitalized. She earned a PhD in economics from Harvard University. Our second guest, Jack Ewing, covers the automotive industry with an emphasis on electric vehicles for the New York Times. Jack writes about the shift to battery-powered cars, the challenge to traditional car makers from Chinese firms like BYD, regulatory policies and tariffs, and the ups and downs of the ever-mercurial CEO of Tesla. Jack has been a journalist for more than 40 years, including 25 years in Germany. He's the author of Faster, Higher, Farther: How One of the World's Largest Automakers Committed a Massive and Stunning Fraud. Jack earned a bachelor's degree from Hampshire College and a master's degree in history from Trinity College. And then finally, our third guest is John Paul MacDuffie, who's professor of management at the Wharton School and director of the program on vehicle and mobility innovation. John Paul's research focuses on the role of human and social capital in achieving high-performance manufacturing in the automotive industry, and is featured centrally in the books The Machine That Changed the World and After Lean Production, Evolving Employment Practices in the World Automotive Industry. John Paul earned his BA from Harvard and his PhD from the MIT Sloan School of Management. So we have this amazing collection of thoughtful and well-versed individuals on not just the automotive industry, but the strategic implications of industrial policy and the broader trade and global system. So what I wanted to do, since recognizing that not everybody in our audience thinks as much about the car industry as all of us do, I wanted to just share a couple of points to frame the discussion. So let me just pull that up. Okay. So the first point I want to share is that the current system of tariffs is high. So we're looking at 15% tariff on vehicles imported from EU, Japan, Korea. Vehicles produced in Canada or Mexico are hit with a 25% tariff on the parts, the value of the parts. There's still high tariffs on materials. And we're maintaining a 100% tariff on Chinese-built electric vehicles that was imposed earlier in the Biden administration. The second point I want to make, just to frame the conversation, is something we talked about a year ago, which is, cars are not sort of homogeneous units built and, assembled and engineered all in one place. Cars are built up off of a very complex flow of sourcing of various components that are sourced from all around the world. We have, complexity in sort of the brand of where the vehicle manufacturer is based, the geography of where the brand is based versus the geography of how value flows into the vehicles sold by that brand. So we have, for many, many, many years, Toyotas and Hondas sold in the USA, and we have Buicks, built in China, re-imported into the US. And a final point about the car industry is, these are big investments to build up the manufacturing facilities to produce these components. So the planning cycle is typically at least 5 years, and hence business stability is important. The third point I want to make to frame the conversation is something we've talked about before, which is the kind of crisis of affordability in the car industry, where currently in the US, new car prices are averaging $50,000, which obviously is not affordable for many Americans. We at the MMI are sort of looking at the drivers behind this, and tariffs are a factor. There was one estimate from Automotive News that looked at the financial reports of the OEMs and estimated a $35 billion impact from tariffs in the year, basically from April 25 to March of 26. And we know that production facilities can move, but it's very expensive and disruptive to do so. And so as we move into an automotive industry that has been characterized by globalization for decades into one that's being increasingly characterized as deglobalization, this all can happen, but it does come at a cost. And there's some other drivers that are pushing this affordability issue in the US as well that we may explore in this conversation. Finally, a fourth point, the role of China as a kind of existential threat for European, Japanese, Korean automakers. China became the largest producer of automobiles in 2009, the same year that China became the largest market in the world, roughly twice the size of the US market, about the size of the US and European markets combined. And China passed Japan to become the largest exporter of automobiles in 2023. And a lot of this, in fact, is driven by tremendous production overcapacity in the home market, pushing this kind of export engine. So Chinese vehicles are showing up everywhere around the world, except the United States. And we're starting, those of us who have visited Mexico recently have seen them all over the streets. They're currently pushing about 25% share in the Mexican market. And earlier this year, the Canadian government struck an agreement with China that would allow 49,000 Chinese electric vehicles to be imported to Canada at a drastically reduced tariff from the current tariff rate. And that is set to sort of gradually, slowly increase. China is really a leader in both electric vehicle and battery technology. Lots of amazing innovation coming out of that country. And we may also have a conversation about what's driving that leadership. I always suggest three words to think about: subsidy, scale, and speed. Okay, so with that, I'm going to turn to Sue Helper. Sue, you have recently published with Laura Tyson and other authors a remarkable paper that touched on many of these themes. I want to just start out with the question, why does this even matter?
Yeah, so the auto industry is really key to U.S. Ecosystems, and not just manufacturing, but also production and design. And without a vibrant auto industry in the U.S., other sectors would falter as well. And the auto industry just accounts for so much demand. So 15% of semiconductor demand, 75% of battery demand, 40% of the installed base of robots in the US is in the auto industry, also machining and stamping. And so, if we actually successfully transition to EVs, we advance adoption of really frontier battery and semiconductor technologies. And without that base demand, it's really hard to get down learning curves. It's really hard to stay competitive. And so it's just baseload demand for not just production, but also engineering, product design, software, chip design, equipment maintenance, and repair. So it's hard for us to move into this electric tech stack of batteries, semiconductors, software, rare earths. All that really depends on autos as driving demand, driving learning curves.
So for years, the automotive industry has been tremendously important for the overall economy of the US or any other country that's an automotive producer. But now with this shift toward electrification, it's an even more sort of profound level of importance. Am I capturing that right?
Yeah, I mean, we talk about the importance in the USA now of drones for national security, but the amount of if you extract rare earths just for drones, the cost you're not going to open a mine for the I don't know, few 100 pounds or whatever of that drones need. If you know as a private sector actor that you can count on, you're going to get a lot of batteries and magnets and motors that depend on these things, then the cost per unit can fall a lot. And also the learning about how you make these things at scale and quickly innovate really depends on the suite of industries.
So what would be if you look back, what would be some perhaps lessons that you would take away from history from, say, the 1980s, 1990s? You know, the car industry, the US domestic car industry has been in trouble before. What can be learned from the past, do you think, that could potentially be applied to today's situation?
Well, this panel has definitely lived through a number of auto crises. Maybe I'll just pick one, which is the rise of the Japanese, which seemed like an existential challenge at the time, and now seems easy compared to what we're seeing from China. And there, I think, we had some policies that did have some positive impact. So we had these voluntary export restraints on Japan in the 1980s and early 90s that got the Japanese to build plants in the US, got the beginning of the transfer of their truly innovative production system, the Toyota production system, which had different ways of thinking about continuous improvement and low inventory production, et cetera, relationships with suppliers and workers. Two mistakes that I would hope we wouldn't do. So one is the Japanese built these brand new factories, often heavily subsidized by southern states. So we suffered through many decades of excess capacity in the auto industry. And second, we ended up with one of the few non-union auto industries in the world. And so then that was actually fairly bad for the overall ability of workers in the US to capture some of the productivity gains. So I think those are things we could learn about. I actually think that having joint ventures with the Chinese might make sense. We'd want to put on a lot of conditions, and we have this experience to point to.
We're definitely going to talk more about that because I want to hear from all three of you about what are your recommendations on, what to do in the current situation. If you had top level officials from the US government sitting with us right now, what should we suggest to them? And indeed from European governments, Canadian government, other governments as well, sort of what would be a set of recommendations that we could provide. But Sue, I want to move on to a word that has been popping up a lot in relation to China, and that word appeared in your paper. The word is involution. Can you just say a couple words about sort of what that is?
So this is a typical part of the Chinese kind of playbook for developing new industries, is the central government puts a lot of incentives for local governments to create a lot of new manufacturing industries. You see this in solar, we're seeing it in autos now. They get the tax revenue, they get some employment, and so as a result, you have literally hundreds of auto companies in China. So we've heard of a few of them. They are now in this kind of dog eat dog competition that has really slashed prices, below their already very low level, and makes them, I think, quite interested in exporting, as you mentioned, quite interested in potentially doing deals that give them access to new markets outside of China, this heavily contested market in China.
Right, right. And I mean, that is this linkage between sort of production capacity and the pressure within the industry. I mean, this is the automotive industry has often been characterized by overproduction, overcapacity. Can you explain to somebody who really doesn't know much about this industry why does that happen? What drives that in general? Why have we seen that before? Why do we keep seeing that?
So a lot of countries want to have an auto industry. Partly it's prestigious, partly it has these forward and backward linkages that I mentioned, so it can drive your progress in a lot of other industries. And so the idea of subsidies of various forms is not unusual. So I mean, China has been really played a lot at this game. So estimates of 30% explicit subsidies plus some implicit subsidies in terms of really low labor and environmental rights. But they are not alone.
Right,
And I
right.
guess I think that it's a possible thing that we tend in the auto industry often to have kind of linear extrapolation from trends. China will have more than 100% of the world auto industry if if trends continue. This is a possibility that things may not continue as they have been.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like there's always like this tremendous optimism among the various vehicle manufacturers that we're going to kill it and we're going to sell 120,000 units of this vehicle and 1.2 million units of that vehicle. And then those numbers often quite aren't realized. And then they're stuck with these plants that, after a lot of investment, were tooled up to handle those volumes and have workers idled, have, expensive production facilities like stamping presses and so forth. Those are idled, and that's all like really, really expensive. So it's interesting that it still remains so difficult to anticipate the market. Although when you think about it, it takes what, 3, 4, sometimes 5 years to bring a new car to market. So when they're planning for that vehicle, they're planning for something into a world in which who knows what's going to happen, right? Who knows who's going to be in office in the White House? Who knows what's going to be happening in the Middle East and so forth. So I would imagine that impacts this whole mismatch between supply and demand in the industry as well. Good. What, let's see, maybe one more question for you, Sue, which is on the topic of China. Um, where, if you had sort of one recommendation to make in terms of how to address this so-called existential threat, what would that be? And we're going to circle back and keep running through this and thinking this through, but I just want to get like your sort of initial take on that.
So I worry that as Jack's article discussed, that we could imagine in 10 years that the U.S. auto industry is essentially nameplates of maybe Ford and GM survive, but with the guts or the propulsion system all Chinese, and that we don't really do a lot of R&D and engineering in the U.S. auto industry anymore. And so to I think there are two lessons. One for the automakers themselves and their investors. There's a lot of profit to be made right now in satisfying demand for large gas guzzling SUVs.
Right.
And I guess what I see in terms of the dilemma that Jinhua proposed is perhaps a little too much of the taking profits now. I mean, GM has just announced a bunch of big investments in engine plants, internal combustion engine plants, and closing down a lot of EV plants. Now their R&D continues, but it's hard. This is an industry where know-how really matters, and so doing a lot in the lab is great, but you really need the factory where you're making millions of batteries to get that dialed in. Policy in the US has not been helpful.
Yeah.
Taken away all the incentives we had for EVs. I think that the pressure to let Chinese vehicles in is going to expand, and to meet it and sort of think about what's a sensible deal that we might make with the Chinese. We take some pages out of their playbook in terms of the way they learned from US multinationals in the 90s and 2000s, and I think that that would demand joint ventures with U.S. auto companies on both sides, keeping engineers, real technology transfer happening, union neutrality, things like that would be things that would be on my list.
Excellent. Okay, and we're going to definitely circle back on this kind of what to do about this moving forward. Jack, I want to turn to you now. You wrote, I think, a really great article about 2 months ago in the New York Times entitled "U.S. Automakers Risk Being Reduced to Niche Producers of Gas Vehicles." And Sue just alluded to that. Can you tell us sort of what went into your thinking and what you learned in the process of putting that article together?
Well, you've seen the thank you, John. You've seen sort of two things happening. One is that policy has done a total U-turn. They took away the incentives for electric vehicles, and as a result, sales did plunge towards the end of last year after those subsidies went away. Um, at the same time, you had the Trump administration dismantling all the clean air rules, and that kind of gave the automakers carte blanche to sell as many big pickups and SUVs as they want to, and that's definitely where they make the most money. At the same time, I think all the automakers are very aware of the things that we've been talking about. They know the Chinese are coming. They know how competitive those vehicles are. They know how far ahead they are in electric vehicle technology. But what they're struggling with now is, which direction do they go in? Do they make as much money now as they can and just see
Yeah.
what happens later? Or do they keep investing in electric vehicles, research and development, maybe making vehicles that people don't want right now, but may well want soon? And, I agree with Susan that I think that, I worry just as an American that the choice they're making is really just to make money while they can on EVs, and to really dial back their electric vehicle programs to the point where it will become very difficult for them to stay competitive once electric vehicles do take over the market. And I think everybody in the industry expects that that will happen.
Well, let's touch on that a little bit. I mean, Sue, would you agree with that assessment that EVs are ultimately inevitable for the global automotive industry?
Yeah, it's a superior product. I mean, I own a hybrid. I love it when it's driving an EV, a 2018 Volt. Um, and it's quieter, less maintenance, more acceleration. I think particularly as prices come down in the US, you're going to see US adoption.
Yeah,
Um, and I think,
yeah.
one issue for the investors is just a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. They worry the US isn't going to be able to make the transition. And so then they want their money now, which then means the auto industry doesn't have the money to invest, which makes that prophecy self-fulfilling. So I worry about that.
And John Paul, I'm just curious, like your thoughts?
Yes, the same. And I think it really is the belief in the industry that electrification is inevitable and it's kind of a question of when.
Mhm.
And I recall this was a conference at the Federal Reserve Bank in Detroit. We had a European supplier who truly a global supplier. And the way he put it is, we're just viewing the US as lagging by X years. We don't know what X is, but eventually they will also be on the same trajectory of electrification as the rest of the world. And that's how we're planning our strategy. And you're absolutely right that the long-term view is necessary for every player in this industry in terms of, technology investments, product planning, everything else about global footprint, and all of the turbulence in policy, particularly coming out of the US now, is really challenging. These companies are used to turbulence, but the amount of it recently is, I think, at extremely high levels. So, makes it a little harder to keep an eye on that inevitable trend and keep moving towards it. And of course, the incentives to pull away from investing in electric vehicles in the US are high, as Sue and Jack both noted, and that's where we're all worried.
Right, right. Okay. So there seems to be this consensus that on a global basis, long term, this trend of automotive electrification will continue. I think most of us would agree we're never going to see 100%, and that's probably just not even the goal, right? I mean, we're going to need petrol, gas-powered vehicles in places like northern Sweden and Wyoming and all sorts of use cases that really I think for many years gas is going to be a better suited solution. But on sort of overall, this is a massive inflection point and will continue. And of course, we've seen China leading, Europe two steps behind, and then the US a few steps behind that. Now, Jack, you pointed to October 1st of last year, the $7,500 subsidy to buy an electric vehicle in the United States ended. Obviously, that put a lot of downward pressure on sales. At the same time, we had relatively low gas prices. Now we've kind of entered into a new reality over the past 2 months. And we see tremendous upward and probably sustained pressure on gas prices. Would you expect we might see some renewed interest in electric vehicles in the US market?
Yeah, well, I think the war in Iran may be the biggest clean energy electric vehicle incentive that's ever been invented. Because if you look at the rest of the world, Europe, uh, everything that's classified as rest of the world, Africa and Latin America, EV sales are rising very quickly. And in the United States, you're starting to see some tentative signs. I mean, I think Cox Automotive, their most recent report was from March to, or maybe it was February to March, that new EV sales were up 20% from a month earlier. Used EV sales have been soaring, and I find that very interesting because in the used EV market, prices are pretty much at parity. So that's kind of giving you a sense of what happens when people have a choice between electric and gas that fits within their budget. Um, it's still pretty tentative in the United States, but you're starting to see it happen. And I think particularly as time goes on, that it could get to be a lot stronger.
Yes. Yeah. And just any thoughts from any of you on the charging infrastructure, where we are in that journey. Roughly one out of every two households in the US do not have the convenience and privilege of a dedicated parking spot. They don't have a driveway, they don't have a garage, they don't have a dedicated spot in a multi-dwelling building where they could install an EV charger and charge their own vehicle with their own electrons purchased through their local utility, hence the reliance on public charging. And there was a large program under the Biden administration to promote the rollout of EV charging infrastructure. Any reflections from any of you on sort of where we are in that journey in the United States?
I mean, I could take that one. The Biden program never got much steam going, and it's still moving very slowly. But I don't know if that's really all that important because the private sector investment in EV charging has continued very strongly, and the growth rate has really not been affected at all by all the other things that we're talking about. So the charging network continues to get better. And I spoke recently to the head of EVgo, one of the big charging companies, and he said they make a profit on the chargers themselves. They're not profitable as a company yet because they're still investing in new sites, but on a charger by charger basis, they make money. So that is a strong incentive for the private sector to keep investing in chargers, and that's what's happening.
Right. Right. Plus, we have the movement toward the North American charging standard, the so-called Teslas, that's enabling non-Tesla vehicles to use the Tesla supercharger network. So that certainly bodes well for folks taking a second or third look at buying an electric vehicle.
Yeah. I would just add that, it seemed that for years we were having this chicken and egg discussion about electric vehicles, right? With the people won't buy because there's not charging infrastructure and they worry about range, but there won't be the investment in the infrastructure because the demand is too low. And I think maybe we're past that. I was more confident a few years ago, but China forward invested into charging infrastructure, which was a great way to prepare for the surge in EV sales that they've had. But I think I'm also encouraged by the trends that Jack described, that the charging infrastructure is growing at a faster pace, and that should eventually help with purchase decisions for U.S. consumers.
Just a word on China. So, Jack, when we were talking earlier, I mentioned why are electric vehicles so much better in China? Subsidy, scale, and speed, right? So scale is about the upstream, relationships with the supply of the minerals and the materials that you need for, to make batteries, the graphite, the nickel, etc. It's, about just amazing manufacturing capability and speed, just moving faster than, Europeans or Americans are moving on this. And you mentioned, Jack, you said, yeah, but also innovation, right? So, and you could argue, okay, speed and scale contribute to innovation. Some really interesting things coming out of China. NIO now has 3,000 swap stations, battery swap stations, built out. We're seeing BYD developing a super fast charging battery. Tell us, I mean, from your travels and interviews and so forth, just can you build on that a little bit about it's so much innovation now coming out of China?
Yeah, well, as you mentioned, it's a brutally competitive market in China. So that really forces people to try to find ways to distinguish their products. And you see it in some really crazy features. I was just reading today about, I think it's a BYD, where the headlights can project a movie onto a flat surface. So you can pull up to a wall and you can show a movie on the wall. I mean, I'm not sure anybody really needs that, but it's sort of an example of the crazy things they're doing to try to get customers. And at a more fundamental level, they have been, I think, very innovative in the way they're manufacturing, looking for ways to simplify, to drive down the cost so that you've got some, really capable vehicles. I've had the occasion to drive the BYD Yuan, which is a little SUV, not too long ago, and it's about a $30,000 vehicle, I think, and it's a nice car. It drives really nicely. It's comfortable inside, and that's just because they've gotten very good at manufacturing in a way that keeps down costs and casting the parts, a lot of innovative things that you don't see as a consumer, but are making them very competitive.
Right. So, I mean, karaoke and massaging seats and projecting movies and these features that we just never really thought of as part of the automobile are now attracting and exciting consumers in China. Do you feel like in your travels in Mexico, Jack? I mean, I asked the question. Okay, so the folks in El Paso are starting to see, these cool BYDs driving down the street. And, Americans love to go on vacation to our neighbors to the south and get into an Uber in Mexico City and just be like, what is this? This is a great vehicle. And then maybe have a chit chat with the Uber driver. And I guess what I'm leading to is, do we reach a point where the American consumer says, no? Like, if I want great wine, I can get great wine from France, right? If I want, great semiconductors, I can get great semiconductors from Taiwan. Why can't I get a great car from China? How do you think about that sort of that expectation among US consumers maybe playing out moving forward?
No, I mean, I agree totally. I just don't think that Americans don't like to be told they can't have the latest technology. And you're already seeing online, Mexicans are driving their cars into Texas. People are seeing them. They're posting about them online. That's going to start happening with Canada. As you mentioned, people go there on vacation. I was in Costa Rica a couple of weeks ago,
Mm.
another country which has lots of Chinese cars. They have no trade restrictions. In fact, I think they're even more enthusiastic about Chinese cars than the Mexicans. And every time you get in an Uber, it's a BYD Seagull. It's another a Chinese car that you've never heard of. Another country where a lot of people go, and yeah, there's no way I think that you can keep that out forever, and that's the reason for this discussion about, so how do you deal with it?
Right, right. Our colleague Bhuvan mentioned that the top selling vehicle in the UK last month was a Chinese branded vehicle. So it's not just Canada and Mexico, but it's, Latin America, the Middle East, Europe, and really the entire rest of the world. So let us circle back to that discussion. And John Paul, I want to turn to you. What can we do? What should we do? How, to Jack's point about this balance between, let's say, you're Ford or GM, do you go for the short-term profits and make everyone on Wall Street happy? Do you go for long-term investment? What, from a business perspective, should be done, and from a government policy perspective, should be done to address this existential threat of Chinese vehicles?
Yeah, it's a big question.
Yeah, it is.
I'll share some thoughts. I mean, I have sympathy, I suppose, or empathy for the challenge of managing a product portfolio in automobiles these days with all of these changes, technological changes, regulatory changes, consumer demand changes. We've talked about internal combustion engines and pure electric vehicles, but then there's also hybrids, which I think Toyota famously took a position a while back that they expected a mix of drivetrain technologies to be the state of the world for quite a while, and they were already very strong in the hybrid drivetrains, and so they were a bit slower to invest in pure battery electric vehicles. They were quite criticized for that at the time, but now, at least at the current moment, they look kind of prescient in being ready for that. And so there's countless decisions tied up in that. What are your R&D investments? Those I think are across the board. But then what products do you plan? If you have it in the lab, but you're not actually building out the products, as Sue said, then that's a dilemma. So I mean, I think back to the era of the Japanese seeming to be unstoppable juggernauts and what we saw happen in the US. And I think it was a combination of an intense sense of a competitive threat and then a set of learning opportunities that in the end helped the US and European incumbents catch up in a bunch of ways. There were also headwinds that the Japanese economy and the Japanese companies ran into. And what are learning opportunities? Some of it's having the competing vehicles in your backyard and having to win over consumers. So this gets to American consumers being able to buy some of these Chinese vehicles, maybe particularly electric vehicles. It gets to joint ventures or other kinds of collaborative tie-ups, which provide opportunities for learning. And those things don't happen fast. I mean, we don't maybe have a deep understanding of all the joint ventures in China and how quickly IP and technology transfer went from the Western producers in China to the Chinese firms. It was really with the switch to electrification that the big jump forward happened in China, and that was not what they were learning from the Western automakers. But I do think the simple presence of either,
Right.
engineers and managers of the same company in the same plant, learning from each other, suppliers from all over the world clustering around an assembly plant and supplying into that plant, part of this globalization of the supply chain. Sue and I did some research looking at Honda's efforts to help its suppliers in the US become closer to the Honda way, or to sort of a lean production approach to being high contributing suppliers. And some of them were big American firms that mostly had supplied, big American suppliers that had mostly supplied the American OEMs. Some were tiny little firms that were responsive to what Honda wanted. Some were Japanese suppliers. Some were Korean suppliers. So all of that, though, created a tremendous learning environment. And so I think that combination of competitive threat and opportunities to learn is very much what we need. And the policy levers, the strategic levers to get there are a little opaque. It's a little different with the Chinese, given the geopolitical tensions. But that's what I would say for now.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I mean, one could argue that the competition from the Japanese automakers, back in the 70s and the 80s was perhaps the best thing ever to happen to the U.S. automotive industry in terms of transferring that learning. Jinhua, I'd like to bring you into the conversation for some sort of reflections.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you. I'm still kind of digesting what Susan, Jack, and John Paul is saying. That's such a great conversation so far. So let me have 2 points. One point from the Chinese entrepreneurial point of view, the other one from the US side, right? On the China side, I think both Susan and Jack, you mentioned this severe competition in China domestically, right? This is unfortunately happening at the same time that China's economy is slowing down. The domestic consumption capacity is really lukewarm and even declining on this, right? So this leads to this overcapacity structural, right? So now if you think about it, if you are one of the entrepreneurs running these companies, by the way, in terms of the degree of competition in China, I would say at least 10 companies that are at a Tesla level innovation capability coexist competing in China, right? So given this low domestic demand, but his capacity, what do they do? Right? I have 2 thoughts to offer on that. One, I think, Susan, you mentioned that the car industry is not the industry itself, it's the core of the entire ecosystem there, right? For example, China, when we talk about the upstream on the battery, the mineral, let me talk about the downstream one. Often the entrepreneur, they often saying, almost all the electric vehicle company now, they are thinking of using the car as experiment to tackle sensors, to tackle digital, to tackle intelligence. Most of them are thinking of autonomous vehicle as the next stage. Many of them are thinking of embodied AI, and AV is just one example, moving towards robotics, right? So that's what they're thinking in their mind of what's the future in the technology sense. The second thing is that the entrepreneurs, they are not going to sit there. They try US tariff, they go to Mexico. And the U.S. strong arm Mexico saying you cannot import from China, you cannot allow China invest anymore. By the way, I just learned last year, 2025, FDI from China to Mexico dropped by 80%. I mean, poor Mexico, all because the U.S. just dictated this, right? But Chinese entrepreneur, I mean, I went to Brazil, right? I'm already in Southeast Asia. I'm in Middle East. I'm going to Europe. So Chinese entrepreneurs are not going to sit there, right? So that's one point. The second one from the US side, we said that the tariffs is not all bad. There are certain situations tariffs is useful. One such condition is if it facilitates learning. The question is, do we use that opportunity to learn, right? We said several possibilities. We even mentioned this joint venture idea. Now the question I have is, the last one here is, what do US companies still have to offer if we have a joint venture, right? The classical notion is market for technology. That's one. But besides that, I do think U.S. domestic OEMs has advantage of better understand the local customers, better understand the local labor issues, local policy issues, right? Those things has enough meaningful thing to offer you for your joint venture. But I do want to mention one most important part U.S. OEM need to have in the joint venture is the degree of humility. That's where it's very different from when Chinese company in the 1980s learning from Volkswagen or General Motors. The Chinese company in the 80s said, I have nothing to offer. You guys are like godlike. I learned everything from you wholeheartedly. And Ford and GM had that degree of humility here. That's another thing I think is important. That's all. Thanks, John.
That's awesome. Thank you, Jim. Any sort of quick reactions to that from the panel before I move on to share audience questions?
I just on the question of humility, that's a really interesting point. I mean, I think Jim Farley, who, by the way, spent much of his career at Toyota, the chief executive of Ford, I mean, he has spoken about going to China and saying that was the most humbling experience he'd ever had. Just to see how far along they were. I think the question is, can they transmit that into the rest of the organization? Because I can certainly picture middle-level managers trying to work with Chinese managers and it not going so well, and that, humility and ego getting in the way.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess I would point out we've rightfully concentrated a lot on the true Chinese innovation that we've seen, but there's other parts of why those cars are so cheap. We've talked a little bit about subsidies, but at the base of almost all these supply chains is forced labor, with the Uyghur people, the 996 working hours. Very lax environmental regulations, all that contributes significantly to the low price. And that's, not something I hope would want to imitate in the US. And so, even if we hopefully absorb the lessons of the innovation, I don't think we would be seeing prices at the similar level available in China.
Yeah, I would just add that we have I think all of us too much tendency to extrapolate from the most striking trends of the moment. And so the Chinese ascendancy now, like the Japanese ascendancy in the past, they will run into some diminishing returns. They will run into limits on the advantages they've had in the domestic market. They will have difficulties breaking into new markets with unfamiliar brands. They'll have quality problems that will tarnish possibly some of the fresh new look, just as people get more experience. And the rest of the world will get galvanized and start to do things to catch up, and policymakers will do things to create space for catching up. So I think probably one of the big mistakes we can try to avoid in our own thinking about this is not doing too much straight line projection of current trends and anticipate this reaction counter reaction dynamic, which really we did see very much in the Japanese kind of dramatic globalization, and then the way the world adjusted to that, and the Japanese to some degree subsided as the exponential existential threat to the rest of the industry.
Excellent. Yeah, very thoughtful reflections. Move on. I've seen a super active chat, so you now have the impossible task of trying to share a few of the questions.
Thanks, John. Fascinating conversation. So I've tried to group the questions around, policy, around manufacturing abilities, and China, the advantages that China has. I think the discussion just now addressed a few of them. On the whole JV bit. Is this the time for US to establish these reverse joint ventures that were established in the 90s in China? Is it time for that? So I think we've covered that, and we've also Susan, you covered the question on Chinese advantage in cost. Some of the labor costs and the lack of labor unions. So why are these Chinese EVs so cheap? So let me get into one question on policy that Richard Ajigo had shared. So this is how much of tariff protectionism is to preserve entrenched profit over R&D and innovation? And this is a very US specific question, right? We have these tariffs, and I mentioned these tariffs sometimes are good if you are innovating at the same time to bring your industry up to the same level of the rest of the world. But are we doing that, or is this just to ensure that GM and Ford are protected and can continue selling these large gas guzzlers, SUVs and pickup trucks?
Sue, you want to take that first?
One thing thing I would say about the tariffs is that they were immediate and they are uncertain and they're ever changing. So we've talked about the complicated supply chain that's global for automotive. It's, that's only a few decades old. We could reverse that if we wanted to. We might or we might want. But this, tariffs alone that change. I've been interviewing a bunch of both suppliers and automakers, and they all talk about this. That you're at this point building a new plant. It's going to be several years before you get a return on that investment. Who knows what the tariffs are going to be then? So it's a particular kind of tariff policy that makes it very hard for reshoring to happen.
And on that topic, what are US automakers doing with their vehicles and sales overseas? Nobody in Europe really wants to buy a pickup truck, American-sized pickup truck for those roads, and many other countries in the world. And the ratio of, I think, EU cars into the US versus US cars into the EU is maybe 1:5. So are the US automakers just content with selling domestically now, and maybe a little bit in Canada?
They still have a few markets where they're strong, Britain, Australia, but the market share of the US automakers abroad has been declining for some time. And you're right.
Ford in the UK was, very strong, but even there, the Focus and the Fiesta, their bread and butter models are on a downward spiral over the last couple of years.
Yeah, and Ford and GM has pulled out of Europe altogether several years ago.
Yeah.
Ford's market share in Europe, I think, is below 3%. So they're really not a big factor in the market anymore. So it's really hard to see any place where they're all that strong. And if you're a Ford executive, I mean, do you invest in those markets, which are not all that profitable, or do you just sort of accept your fate and keep trying to sell where you are strong, which is mostly the United States?
Yeah, and there was some confluence of the U.S. manufacturers move away from sedans and from small cars and servicing those markets. So you get a pullback of investment and strategic direction that's both about foreign markets, about sedans, and about small cars. That's kind of simultaneous, and makes it very hard to imagine competing anew in any of those spaces.
Last one on policy. We mentioned Canada, opening up 49,000 Chinese EVs annually every year. So what could be the possible downstream impacts of Canada and the US's trade policy as it relates to Chinese EV imports? Is there a risk that this will result in fewer reasons for the two governments to cooperate? As we know, the Canada and US American automotive manufacturing system is well entrenched. Windsor and Detroit, there's so much back and forth. But Canada seems to be going a separate, different path now. So what is the risk in the future for manufacturing? And Canada may welcome even more Chinese EVs. It's 49,000 now. It could become 200,000 after a couple of years. Is that a genuine risk that the US needs to be worried about? Because Canada has always traditionally been a strong adopter of US vehicles and supporting the manufacturing supply chain.
Yeah. I think the reason Canada did that in the first place is that they've pretty much given up on the relationship with the Trump administration. They've already, the Canadian auto parts industry and vehicle assembly industry they've already had some factory shutdowns. They've already suffered quite a lot. And I think they've kind of reached the point where Carney, the prime minister, thought they didn't have anything to lose. And maybe this would get the attention of the administration in a positive way.
I wanted to say one thing about just the problems of the U.S. internal market that our auto companies' competitiveness, I think, is hampered by the extreme income inequality in the U.S. So they make $50,000 cars not because they couldn't make cheaper ones, but because that's where the profit is. So only a third of Americans buy new cars, and then they just literally trickle down through, and so that makes it very difficult to sell in markets that don't have these characteristics. Except the Middle East. We're also strong in Saudi Arabia. So, tens of thousands of cars there. But
I think that's a strategic decision by the U.S. Car makers, and that the Asian car makers do that differently. I don't think Toyota makes a huge amount of money on the Corolla, but that brings in customers that then maybe later on trade up. And I know that Hyundai follows that policy also. They don't make that much money on their small cars or their sedans, but they see that as a way to build customer loyalty, even if it doesn't pay off right away.
They also, but their home market also buys these cars.
I guess they can, yeah.
And so I think that's what's different. You don't want a giant Highlander or something in Tokyo, right? Or Seoul.
Susan, this question is a little more to your recent paper. Is there an accepted minimum level of auto manufacturing capacity, inclusive of innovation capacity, that is necessary for a country to maintain desired defense and upstream and downstream industrial capacity? Based on your paper, is there like a ballpark figure for a country the size of the US? And
I saw that question in the chat, and I'd be love to continue that discussion. I think it's a great one. I worry that for some parts we are already below it, in terms of our ability to support a tooling industry, a dye industry, stamping presses, and also the fact that the industry is getting spread out, across not just the Midwest, but also the South. So I worry, I guess I'd say if we were half the size, that would clearly be too small. And I will be thinking about that question for a while and try to come up with some reasons why I say that. But what the study would really be sort of, let's understand the minimum efficient scale in a variety of industries, and not just for production, but also for things like product design, engineering, et cetera, that typically have bigger economies of scale even than the factories.
Maybe I'll get one last one. And we discussed Japan, a couple of times. So the Japanese and China seem to have adopted a different approach, where Toyota is partnering with a lot of Chinese OEMs who basically make the whole car, and Toyota is then branding it as a Toyota. So Toyota in China is very different from what they sell globally elsewhere. So is that a model that, GM could perhaps adopt in China? What do you think about that? Will 10 years down the line, will Toyota even be needed in that relationship? Or is that, a risky relationship to start off with? Thoughts on that?
I mean, GM has joint ventures, also SAIC.
Yeah.
I guess I don't know enough, maybe others do, about what the exact division of labor is in that relationship, and what GM is actually contributing these days.
This is more about the type of the car. So the Toyotas have been developed by Chinese automotive companies, and it's less Toyota and more the other brand, it's the Chinese brand. So and Jack, I don't know, since given your travels, if you have any views.
Yeah, I can't claim to be an expert in that. I mean, my impression is that that's kind of a stopgap measure by Toyota. And, by the way, we've been talking about the American car makers, but I think China's just as big a threat to Toyota and BMW and Mercedes and all the other Western car makers. And they're also, I think the chairman of Toyota has made a statement to that effect not too long ago, that this was existential for them as well. So I don't know that much about what Toyota's doing in China, but my impression is that this is just a way to stay in the market until they can develop their own vehicles.
I mean, it's the biggest market in the world now, right? And nobody really can afford to be left out of it. And as the consumer preference changes to Chinese brands, then the Western manufacturers, the Japanese and Chinese, have to scramble to stay in the market. And we'll probably see a variety of ways in which they respond to that challenge.
Thank you. I think back to you, John.
Yeah, it's already 1 o'clock, so to interrupt this conversation, we have so many things we could discuss. Susan, John Paul, and Jack, thank you so much. This is a brilliant conversation. Everybody, please join me. Thank the panel for today's conversation.